Welcome to this special broadcast from WVVH-TV News. I'm Ernie Schimizzi, and I'm joined by Karl Grossman, our Chief Investigative Reporter. And Karl, what a history you've had reporting on the environment. You've been interviewed with this present tragedy that's taken place in Japan by media from all over the world. And given that you're our Chief Investigative Reporter, we wanted to share with our viewers your comments, your noted abilities in this field, because right now there seems to be a lot of misinformation surrounding what's happening and what this means to the world in large. We're calling this news special Nuclear Tragedy. Is it too late? Are we too late?
No. I mean, what's been happening in Japan, and we don't at this point know the full extent. In fact, the full extent may only be manifest in months. But what already has occurred is going to cause death to many people in Japan, particularly the people around that nuclear facility. And again, things might get worse the next few hours, the next few days, the next few weeks. And some of that stuff, some of that nuclear poison, it's going to spread. It's going to spread further. But the issue on this beautiful sunny spring day on eastern Long Island at this point is, how bad is it going to be? Is it going to be a disaster, which it is already, or is it going to end up to be a global nuclear catastrophe causing multiple meltdowns?
Well, the Fukushima Daiichi power plant is being described as a failure of the reactor's cooling system after the devastating earthquake and tsunami. Now, this particular design of this power plant, the Fukushima plant, is a GE Mark I design. Could we talk a little bit about that? Because that seems to have been the standard all over the world.
Well, there's a variety of designs. The boiling water reactor, which is what General Electric has specialized in, and then a pressurized water reactor, which is what Westinghouse has been building. The Soviets have their own design and so forth, but basically those pressurized water reactors and the boiling water reactors are the big sellers, the Chevy, so to speak, of nuclear power. But whether it's a boiling water reactor or a pressurized water reactor, they need massive amounts of coolant, 1 million gallons a minute. And if the coolant stops for just 15 to 30 seconds, the emergency core cooling system, which is kind of like a series of showers, has to kick into action to cool the core. If it doesn't, and it didn't in those plants because of the tsunami causing floods and the diesel generators, just electricity was lost, the diesel generators didn't kick in.
And these were not watertight buildings, so even though they were built by the water, these reactors, when those diesel plants got flooded, that was the end of it.
That was it. Again, power was lost. They tried battery power for days. You know, but the issue is what kind of damage happens when you have a loss of coolant accident. Again, 15 to 30 seconds. And first book I did on nuclear power, Cover Up What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power, is its title. It's 1980. I wrote it after the 3 Mile Island accident. And I have a document in the book which declares that within 15 to 30 seconds after the accident, through the emergency core cooling system, control must be regained. If it's not, what you have is the beginning of a melting process which causes heat, a lot of heat. Indeed, if you really want to consider something that underlines the madness of nuclear technology, consider the fuel rods, and the word is zirconium. When they first began developing nuclear power plants, they looked for something to put those uranium pellets in, and it's a technical issue, but to have fission occur and so forth. And the only metal they could come up with, they tried stainless steel, they tried other metals, was something called zirconium, which was made into zircaloy is the name for it. So you have about 20 tons of zirconium-based fuel rods in a nuclear plant. Now, it was used because it allowed the neutron action to move between fuel rods. Stainless steel blocked for neutrons. The other major use at the time of zirconium, the speck on a flash bulb that explodes, the other major, zirconium is explosive. So here you have 20 tons of zirconium fuel rods in a nuclear plant. The zirconium explodes at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's what you get with a loss of coolant accident. That kind of heat up. A full meltdown occurs at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Short of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, what occurs is that the zirconium gives off hydrogen. So these hydrogen explosions that we've been...
Which is also flammable.
Which has been happening. Well, yeah, it sucks in what water and steam is available, the zirconium does, takes in the oxygen and emits hydrogen. Like during the 3 Mile Island accident in '79, there was this mysterious hydrogen bubble. It was no mystery. This kind of problem, again, before a meltdown occurs, an explosion of the hydrogen given off by the fuel rods because of the zirconium has been a huge worry. In fact, engineers, nuclear engineers...
Unexpected. It was something that was 35 years ago. There were engineers who who worked for GE, who resigned. Could we talk a little bit about what they saw as the problem of this design of this type of Mark I plant?
Yeah, well, there was 3 engineering supervisors, Dale Bridenborough, Craig Miner, and so forth. They resigned as a matter of conscience since 1976. They worked at General Electric, but the news reports have had it that they resigned because of the flaws in the Mark I. That isn't why they resigned. I mean, in part, they resigned because of that. But they testified, in fact, in my book, Cover Up What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power, I have a portion, a facsimile portion. I mean, you can see their actual statement to the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy in Congress saying that we believe, these are 3 nuclear engineers, that nuclear power represents a lethal threat to all future generations. And we could no longer continue in this field having any part of this, this deadly enterprise. So it isn't just a matter of GE or Westinghouse or a Chernobyl-type plant of Soviet design. All nuclear power plants are deadly. I mean, all they really are the most dangerous way to boil water ever conceived.
Well, this is a statement that you've made in your book and in recent articles, and basically it's to boil water, create steam, and use that energy to create electricity. But here in the United States, is it true that 20% of our power comes from nuclear power plants?
Yeah, 20% of our electric power.
Electric.
Not total power. You know, it's in terms of end-use energy, it becomes more complicated, but yet 20% of our electricity is generated by nuclear power. But let me also note there's a reserve capacity in an electric system in the U.S. of 20%. So if all the nuclear power plants in the country were shut down today, as in my judgment they should be, we could go on and we could do what we should have done years ago. I mean, here's the wind blowing today. Wind technology is now so advanced, it's so sophisticated, it's far cheaper wind power than nuclear power. The sun is shining on our faces. It's shining here. We're in Sag Harbor, New York. It feels like we're in the Barbados. It's a wonderful spring day. And at my house, which is about 3 miles from where we sit, last year I had installed photovoltaic panels made in Japan, incidentally. I mean, if the technological expertise in Japan would be focused not on nuclear, but on solar and wind and all the many other sources of clean, safe, renewable energy technology, they would have been and can still be far, far better off. In any case, at my little house a few miles from here, because of modern solar energy technology, that electric meter, it goes backwards. I mean, I'll come home after the interview and I will have made money on the electricity from the sun, and we all can all do that.
But for some reason, nuclear, and our president has come on the record and said he's supportive of nuclear power. You feel this is a step in the wrong direction?
Oh, not a step in the wrong direction. It's a step over such a cliff that you wouldn't believe. I mean, let me give a little history, because nuclear power has less to do with technology, and we've been talking about technology and zirconium and all this kind of stuff, more to do with politics and vested interest, which begin talking about things in close proximity to where we sit, which begins, you look out over the water, and we're sitting here, and we're on Sag Harbor on the waterfront, and if you had a boat, and I'm a sailor, and you just go a little bit to the left, you'll run into another peninsula. I mean, there is North Haven Peninsula, and if you go a little bit to the west, you'll see it, just a few miles down the bay, you'll see Nassau Point, which is a peninsula coming down from the North Fork. Well, Albert Einstein summered at Nassau Point in the 1930s. And in 1939, he and other refugees from the Nazis, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, and so forth, were very concerned. These were physicists who were aware that in Germany in 1938, the year before, the splitting of the atom, fission, had occurred. And they felt that if Hitler got nuclear weapons, that would be, that would be endgame. So there in Nassau Point in 1939, in fact, I've reprinted as a facsimile in my book, Cover Up What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power, my first book of several on nuclear technology, the letter to President Roosevelt. And that kicks off the Manhattan Project.
The key to the atom's secrets was first given to the world in 1905, when the genius Albert Einstein defined the relation between all matter and energy and evolved his revolutionary theory of special relativity. Then, in 1919, Lord Rutherford confirmed Einstein's theory by smashing the nitrogen atom. By 1934, Italy's Enrico Fermi and France's Frederick Joliot had made substantial progress. Meanwhile, in America, scientists like Arthur H. Compton, Harold C. Urey, and Ernest O. Lawrence were carrying on intensive research. In 1939, Lisa Meitner, exiled from Germany, computed the results which could be obtained from splitting uranium. Dr. Pigram concentrated on research at Columbia University. Working under his supervision were Dr. Leo Szilard and Dr. Fermi, who were laying the groundwork for a chain reaction in uranium. Encouraged by their successful progress, Szilard discussed with Dr. Einstein in the summer of 1939 the results of their findings and stressed the urgent need for action by the U.S. government. Conscious of the disaster which would inevitably follow if Nazi Germany should be the first to succeed in releasing atomic energy, Dr. Einstein decided to write a personal letter to the president. The letter was immediately brought to the attention of the president. Recognizing the critical significance of Einstein's message, President Roosevelt signed an order appointing the director of the National Bureau of Standards, Dr. Lyman J. Briggs, as chairman of a special advisory committee on uranium. After only one meeting, the committee was able to report that an atomic bomb was a definite possibility.
The world's first atomic bomb was detonated on July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico. A fireball with the explosive power of over 10,000 tons of dynamite, the bomb ushered in a new era of war. 3 weeks later, the United States dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, utterly and totally destroying the city. A few days after that, a second bomb brought the same fate to Nagasaki.
And the idea was to fight fire with fire and build atomic bombs before the Germans did. But the key issue in terms of nuclear power occurs after the war. We've dropped a couple of bombs in Japan. We build more nuclear weapons. But what else could be done with nuclear technology to perpetuate the establishment that was created during World War II, these national nuclear laboratories, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Argonne, and so forth. I mean, there were all these scientists there, and so they want to keep going. A lot of the work, and you know how the U.S. government works, it contracts out its work to recently I went to a federal facility, whacking hut guards. The corporations GE and Westinghouse were given big contracts during the Manhattan Project to be involved. What else can we do with nuclear technology? So they think of, well, food irradiation. We can keep strawberries red for a few years, or nuclear-powered airplanes, or nuclear-powered rockets. Crazy ideas. And then they finally figured, well, maybe, because some of the early reactors were built to produce plutonium for weapons. Plutonium was discovered in 1941. And at that point, they thought, well, we could use not just highly enriched uranium for bombs. The Hiroshima bomb was highly enriched uranium, but we can use plutonium, which we can create ourselves for bombs. The Nagasaki bomb was plutonium, and virtually all atomic bombs since plutonium. But in these early reactors to produce plutonium, really plutonium production reactors, there was a lot of heat. Now that's the model for nuclear power. Why can't we couple the missions, produce plutonium for more weapons, and also have that heat boil water, turn a turbine, and make electricity? I mean, the Soviets have been very explicit about that, and I've been in Russia a number of times speaking on the issue and the dangers of nuclear power, and there's no issue. Our plans are dual use, producing plutonium for weapons and electricity and so forth.
Speaking of that, it's called MOX fuel?
Well, MOX fuel is one of the reactors in Japan. It not only had conventional enriched uranium. In a nuclear plant, it's enriched to 3% uranium-235. Most of naturally occurring uranium is uranium-238. Now, we're getting technical again, but people should understand this. When uranium-238 is in proximity to fission, it grabs onto a neutron and it changes to plutonium. This is what happened in 1941. They figured, well, we don't have to find more high-grade uranium in the Congo or in New Mexico. And they thought they would get short, you know, of high-grade uranium. So Glenn Seaborg, who I've interviewed, he's dead now, figured out that, no, we can take uranium-238, which doesn't fission, it isn't fissile. But if we put it near where fission is occurring, it'll grab on a neutron and become plutonium. And plutonium splits. So there's been an idea all along to...
And in splitting, it creates...
Well, when an atom like uranium-235 or plutonium splits, what it creates, and this people must understand, heat, like we say, which would boil water, various kinds of radiation, or rays, alpha, beta, gamma rays, you know, and then, and this is truly important, what I call fission products. When I was in high school, they talked about after fission you'd have lighter elements. What this means is you start off with U-235 or plutonium-239. You hit it with a neutron, it splits into elements with lower atomic numbers, like strontium-90 and cesium-137 and iodine-131. The problem, and this, again, is so urgent for people to understand, these are lethal twins of safe and stable elements. You know, like it's not the iodine you put under your cut, it's radioactive iodine. In fact, that's why they're distributing potassium iodide pills. It would fill your thyroid with it. Iodine-131 is like such a cause of cancer, thyroid cancer. So the idea would be to fill your thyroid with good iodine and it won't take in the radioactive iodine. But there's no magic pills for all the other fission products, these poisons. And Ernie, in terms of MOX fuel, what that is fuel with a lot of plutonium in it. It's actually from nuclear waste, so to speak, because not only fission products are generated, but again, a lot of that uranium-238 becomes plutonium, which then could be split, could then fission. So they've been using it as fuel in Japan and elsewhere. Very, very dangerous. Plutonium is considered the most radioactive substance on Earth, particularly airborne. If it becomes vaporized, just breathe in a speck of plutonium, a millionth of a gram of plutonium, it's lung cancer. And in fact, after the Manhattan Project, they did tests on the toxicity of plutonium with beagle dogs, very famous tests. I write about this in my work. And 100% of the time, when beagle dogs are exposed to vaporized plutonium, lung cancer. So if the plutonium bursts out of a nuclear plant, if it bursts out of a spent fuel pool, it and the fission products are going to kill. I mean, let me talk about a speech made, if I could. It's just a minute, but it gets you right to the issue here. Because, like, remember during the Clinton time, the line was, it's the economy stupid. Here, when you talk about nuclear technology, it's the radioactivity. I'm not looking at you, you know, it's the radioactivity. And Hyman Rickover, Admiral Hyman Rickover, he's the father of the nuclear navy. He was in charge of construction of the first nuclear plant built in the U.S. in Shippingport in Pennsylvania, opened in 1957. Well, he finally understands the danger of all this. And in 1982, he retires from the Navy and makes a speech to a committee of Congress where he says, 2 billion years ago, there was so much natural radioactivity on the planet that life couldn't exist. Life couldn't exist. But as those poisons cooled down, those radioactive poisons went through their half-lives and hazardous lifetimes, life could begin. Then Rickover goes on, by doing fission, we are recreating the very poisons that precluded life from existing. And this is Hyman Rickover, not Greenpeace, and there, says Admiral Rickover, the human race is going to wreck itself, and we must, this is what he told Congress, outlaw nuclear reactors. And just, I might add, not to be anthropomorphic in terms of the human race wrecking its life in general. I mean, there are a few species, cockroaches, for example, are able to absorb 200 times more radioactivity than people. But I don't know if we want cockroaches to inherit the earth. The issue here is an issue of life and death. In fact, in that first book, I start off with, from the Bible, I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse, choose life for you and your, I'm paraphrasing, I hate to paraphrase the Bible, you and your descendants. And that's what, this beyond everything else, this is not a technical issue. It's a hugely moral issue. In fact, Einstein, after the war, after having written that letter, after kicking off the Manhattan Project, writes a book called Out of My Later Years. And he said, I wouldn't have lifted pen to paper if I knew the Germans wouldn't have gotten the bomb. And he talks about, in the book, nuclear technology being a terror. And he says that terrors aren't new to humanity, to the history of humanity. Horrible threats are not new. But now, he says, the scale of destruction, that's what's new. And that's what Japan and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island have warned us so clearly. I mean, there's been a lot of minor accidents in between.
Well,
that nuclear power,
about that. There are constantly accidents that are occurring that are not being reported.
Well, this technology is so fraught, I mean, inherently fraught with danger. Like our president says, safe nuclear power, it's an absolute contradiction. Nuclear plants are susceptible to mechanical malfunction, and they have them all the time, to terrorism, and that's what we have to be terribly concerned about now. I mean, you can see how vulnerable these machines will always be to tsunamis and to earthquakes and to hurricanes, and go on and on. And beyond that, we don't need this. We don't need nuclear power. We can, I mean, go solar, go wind, go geothermal, go with algae. I mean, there's all kind of ways to power our society. But if I can get back to the political reason why we're in this box. So after the war, the Manhattan Project tries to push things nuclear. And one of the ideas it gets is the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project becomes the Atomic Energy Commission after the war. But it's the Manhattan Project people. It's the same cast, crew, and corporations. And they're looking to, they have this vested interest, they're looking to promote it. And looking at all things nuclear to promote it. And they think, well, maybe nuclear power plants. utilities wouldn't touch it. Remember playing a game where you're a kid, Monopoly, and the utility card is always terribly conservative? We're going to take this exposure with it. We're going to take this risk with these power plants, with nuclear power, atomic energy. That's not, I mean, the Atomic Energy Commission could sort of claim, oh, the peaceful atom. Frankly, there's never been a peaceful atom. It's two sides of the same coin. But utilities were scared. The pivotal year is 1957. In 1957, that Rickover plant I mentioned, Shippingport, opens. And Lewis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, declares as the plant opens, if you, the utilities, don't build these nuclear plants, we, the government, will. Second thing that happens in 1957, very important, is that was the stick. A carrot was offered. Something called the Price-Anderson Act was passed. It still exists, which is supposed to be kind of a temporary crutch for this would-be nuclear industry. And what it did then and still does now is limit liability. Initially, $500 to $560 million, with the government paying the first $500 million. In fact, anybody, well, now it's $10 billion, but that's just a fraction of what the damages, can be. Or look at Japan, will be many tens of billions of dollars. In fact, viewers should just, after the show, maybe look at your homeowner's policy. And every homeowner's insurance policy in the United States have what's called a nuclear clause, which says this policy doesn't protect against losses from radiation or from nuclear accidents and so on. Look at your policy. Everybody has it. So, I mean, I could trip here on Long Wharf in Sag Harbor and sue the owners of Long Wharf, now Suffolk County, but you can't. If there's a catastrophe at any nuclear plant nearby and half of the United States population live within 50 miles from a nuclear plant, you could only sue for a few pennies on the dollar, if that. I mean, you're not going to be compensated. In law, you're supposed to be compensated for all damage, but nuclear power is the exception because it was this nuclear establishment pushing it. The other thing that happened in '57, Ernie, which is so important to understand, some might say, well, maybe they thought it would be completely safe and everything would be okay, and thus they did Price-Anderson. Also in '57, at Brookhaven National Laboratory, which is here on Long Island, it was established to do some pure science in nuclear, in atomic energy, but also to develop civilian uses of nuclear technology. A lot of those Manhattan Project labs stuck with bomb engineering and production. Los Alamos, there was a new one called Livermore, which ended up building the hydrogen bomb and so forth. But here on Long Island, Brookhaven Lab was set up to really focus on promoting the civilian uses of nuclear technology, and again, doing research too. Well, in 1957 at Brookhaven Lab, the first major study, again, 57, of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear power plants was done. And it talks about damages, not 560 million, 7 billion. It talks about thousands of people losing their lives. Effects, because the war talked about 2-mile zones and 10-mile zones. Way back then, WASH 740 talked about people being impacted 45 miles from a nuclear plant. So, they absolutely knew how dangerous these plants were, and this is key. The WASH 740 report was based on 100 megawatt plants, a seventh, an eighth the size of plants that were actually built. So what the Brookhaven National Laboratory folks did was do a second report called WASH 740 Update, predicated on the plants, like these Japanese plants or the plants we have in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And then you're talking about not just $7 billion in damage, you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of damage and far many more lives lost. So what I'm saying is that the nuclear establishment knew, and I say nuclear establishment meaning those nuclear zealots in government, at the Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the National Nuclear Laboratories, and these corporations like GE and Westinghouse, up to their neck in the nuclear business, they've known all along that catastrophic accidents will be quite possible. And what I mean by the nuclear establishment, these government entities and the nuclear scientists and engineers and bureaucrats that work for them, the Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the National Nuclear Laboratories, and then these corporations deeply involved in nuclear power, GE and Westinghouse. And this establishment has known all along about the potential for huge catastrophe. I mean, I have in my hand the newest report done, and this isn't so new, it's the 1980s, because they don't want to have this kind of report come out again. But in the 1980s, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission looked at every nuclear power plant in the United States, and I mean, the report is unbelievable. Looks at peak early fatalities, peak early injuries, peak cancer deaths, and scale cost in billions. Scale cost is like you're going to have an area like around Chernobyl rendered uninhabitable for millennia, so they figure out the cost in real estate. We could look at the Indian Point nuclear plants. They're 2 and 3. They're just 28 miles north of New York City. Here's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, not Greenpeace, saying that with a loss of coolant accident and breach of containment, you have, this is from one plant alone, Indian Point 3, 50,000 early fatalities, peak early fatalities, 167,000 injuries, 14,000 cancer deaths, and this is in 1980s dollars, 300 billion. So multiply that by 3 and you got $1 trillion. Or, I mean, we're sitting here right across the bays, and Long Island Sound is the Millstone nuclear plant. Here they're talking about, I mean, you don't have as many people as in New York, 23,000 early fatalities, 30,000 early injuries, cancer deaths, so forth. It's 174 billion. The real estate isn't worth as much, sadly to say, up in Connecticut as around New York City. Now, the question has to be, though, what is the likelihood of this kind of accident, this kind of catastrophe occurring? And this is why I say that these people have known all along that what has occurred in Japan, what occurred at 3 Mile Island, what occurred in the former Soviet Union at Chernobyl, it's quite likely. This document here, this is from 1985, and Edward Markey, who was a congressman who chaired a subcommittee on nuclear safety, asks formally, what does the Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the NRC staff believe the likelihood of a severe core melt accident to be in the next 20 years? For essentially, they're talking about the 100 nuclear power plants seen as operating during that period, and we have 104 now. And the response is the probability of such an accident, this is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in this period would be 45%. And then on the bottom it goes on, that might be off by 5%. So essentially what the NRC said in 1985, that the likelihood among the 100 U.S. nuclear power plants over a 20-year period of having a severe core melt accident, not a minor malfunction, to be 50-50. 50-50. So these people have known all along that they've been, it's kind of like the Tobacco Institute times 1,000. This is like lethal nicotine. I mean, nicotine, that may be redundant. It's like lethal nicotine at a scale, it's almost inconceivable. It's, as Einstein said, it's the scale here, it's the scale, and these people have known it all along. Indeed, there's a professor at the University of Illinois who, through the years, has been in contact with me, and only recently has, because of what's happening in Japan, has sent me more of his proposal. He's an expert in international law in the Nuremberg Tribunal, and he believes that those who have been promoting nuclear power through the years, knowing the mass destruction it can easily, in fact, it's expected to cause, should be subject to the principles of Nuremberg.
With the present situation in Japan, there'll be a dead zone around this plant for years and years. It'll be a part of the earth, and I've been to Japan. It's a beautiful place, you know, and the people take such care, and they're so, in their way, so respectful of nature. I mean, sitting in some of these little Japanese temples, and you're surrounded by ponds, and here their landscape has been savaged. And but honestly, if it just, how can I say just?
if it's just a good portion of Japan ending up to be a sacrifice zone, which is horrific, it's terrible, it's just terrible, that would be one thing, that would be a disaster. But what I fear is that, and again, we're speaking now, and God forbid this occurs, and we don't know the end of this all, it could be far, far worse. A book was published last year by the New York Academy of Sciences on the consequences of the Chernobyl nuclear plant accident in 1986, and it concludes that based on now available medical data, 985,000 people died worldwide as a result of the nuclear accident at Chernobyl. Incidentally, if you go to the website of the United Nations created an International Atomic Energy Agency, it says that well, maybe 4,000 people will die as a result of Chernobyl after all. But the IAEA was created in the 50s to be a mirror image of our, I was mentioning before, our Atomic Energy Commission, which was set up to promote and regulate nuclear technology, again, out of the Manhattan Project. The IAEA is set up to promote and somehow at the same time regulate. We abandoned our Atomic Energy Commission. We got rid of it in '74 because it was in conflict of interest. And we created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, which frankly still promote, like you wouldn't believe, nuclear technology. But the IAEA is still pushing hard on nuclear technology and covering up when it comes to accidents and all sorts of problems. Back to the important book by Dr. Alexei Yablokov and the doctors Nestorenko, noted European scientists on the consequences of Chernobyl. Essentially 1 million people dying so far because of the contents of one nuclear power plant being discharged, and a lot of the death is, or has been, in Belarus and in Russia, in the Ukraine where the plant was, 60 miles from Kiev. But it's stuff, that stuff got all over the world, and they calculate based on radiation deposited all over the world after the, particularly after the explosion at Chernobyl, and for weeks the fire couldn't be put out. They calculate radiation deposited all over the northern hemisphere. So you got 1 million people dead as a result of the Chernobyl catastrophe. What you have in Japan involves the potential of all the poisons in 1, 2, 3, could be more nuclear plants possibly blowing out and obviously affecting the people of Japan. But if it's like Chernobyl, that poison, it forms into a plume and it floats. Some of it is stopped by mountains. Some of it just falls out naturally. Some falls out with the rain, and it circles and circles and circles the planet, like the fallout during the tests in the 50s and 60s of atomic weapons. But the thing is that one nuclear plant has more radioactivity, 1,000 times more radioactivity, one nuclear plant, than an atomic bomb. That's because in an atomic bomb you have about 15 pounds of fissionable material, and for a second there's fission and it explodes. In a nuclear plant you have 200,000 to 300,000 pounds of nuclear material, which fissions, and these fission products, these poisons are created month after month, year after year. So if all that stuff, they call it nuclear waste. That's a nice name for it. It's much worse. It's the most horrible nuclear poisons. It's the cesium-137, the iodine-131, the plutonium, and so forth. If that stuff gets out, like it got out of Chernobyl, people and other forms of life die, and cancer becomes epidemic and so forth where it falls. But what you have in Japan, and again, God forbid this should happen, you could have the contents of more than one nuclear plant being emitted. Moreover, and this is my big worry, those spent fuel pools. In a spent fuel pool, you have the hotly radioactive fuel rods from many years stored. So you have in those spent fuel pools, if one nuclear power plant has a radioactive inventory 1,000 times more than one atomic bomb, a spent fuel pool, which has no containment, I mean, it's just a corrugated steel, it's like a big swimming pool, and the water has to be circulated, has the contents of many thousands of pounds. If 1 million people died as a result of what came out of one nuclear plant, imagine the results if not just the contents of one nuclear plant at any one time, but many times the contents of one nuclear plant at any one time come flying out. And just let me, again, get technical again, but it's important. How a loss of water accident occurs is that the coolant water in the swimming pool, like spent fuel pool, if it stops, there's a heat up, again, of the control rods, of the fuel rods. And remember, those fuel rods are made of zirconium. So everything in the spent fuel pool, a nuclear power plant has hundreds of nuclear assemblies. Nuclear assembly, there's 100 fuel rods to each nuclear assembly, and several hundred, depends on the plant design, hundreds in a nuclear plant. In a spent fuel pool, you have thousands of assemblies, thousands of assemblies. The zirconium, again, would explode at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's called a loss of water accident. And in a China syndrome accident, a loss of coolant accident. And if you're interested in how that happens, I can explain. This is what we fear out of Japan. But as the core moves down through the molten, white-hot molten core, it just bores through the stainless steel containment vessel, down through the cement base of the nuclear plant. Actually, I'm explaining it now. And then it takes several hours, or it could take days, and we're looking in these days, hits the water table beneath the plant, and then in that violent reaction between white molten core and the water below, there's this eruption through the earth of a radioactive plume, which then moves out into the environment and floats in the air. Some of the radioactivity in a so-called China syndrome accident, called China syndrome because if we had a meltdown on a plant in the U.S., seemingly the core would be going to China. It doesn't go to China, it just goes to the water table below. Maybe for these Japanese plants, it's heading seemingly in the direction of Chicago. It should be called the Chicago syndrome accident. But in any case, some of the radioactive poisons are lost to the ground. In a spent fuel pool accident, again, you have far more radioactive poisons. Nothing is lost to the ground. You have thousands of pounds of plutonium. I mean, theoretically, Dr. Helen Caldicott says 1 pound of plutonium has the potential, this is quite theoretical, to kill everybody on Earth. 1 pound of plutonium. She describes the most toxic substance in the universe, is the way she puts it. I don't know from 1 pound, I mean, how are you going to divide into the millionths of a gram, 1 pound? But if you have, out of a spent fuel pool, in an explosive situation, thousands of pounds of toxic plutonium flying out in a lethal plume full of other radioactive poisons as well, and again, God forbid this happens in this situation, you have, I'm a Jewish fella, and I don't like to use the word Holocaust for much of anything else, but you have a nuclear Holocaust on your hands that's not going to end. I mean, even what's happened now is not going to end. These poisons that have been emitted will be around all but forever. See, with radioactive substances, it isn't like Bhopal. There was a pesticides plant explosion a number of years ago in Bhopal, India. They could go in afterwards and neutralize the chemical toxins. You can't do that with radioactive substances. They're here, and essentially here forever. I mean, plutonium has a half-life of 24,500 years. And you multiply a half-life by 10 to 20 for its hazardous lifetime. In fact, if you take the 20 figure, you can take 10 or 20, because at the end of each half-life, it's half as radioactive. So if you want to be conservative, plutonium is radioactive, and hotly so, for 245,000 years, or 500,000, or 500,000. This is a long time that it'll end up contaminating and polluting our planet. And as I say, this is, I mean, you can blame it on this, you can blame it on that, but I blame it on those, if you want to assign blame, and I think blame at this point must be assigned, and we move to save clean energy, you must blame it on the people promoting a technology they know can kill. I mean, the tobacco people did it for years, and they sure as hell killed a lot of people with lung cancer. Lots of people. I have people in my family who smoked and died of lung cancer. Yes. But here, I mean, we're not, this is involuntary. I mean, smoking was maybe the Tobacco Institute covered it up for years, and my relatives didn't. But when you deal with nuclear technology, the whole planet now, its population, guinea pigs, subjected to these horrid consequences, which these corporations and these government officials know will be inevitable, and they're all but asking for it. I mean, Ernie, just let me note, like just to the north of us here are the Millstone nuclear plants. They're 22 miles from where we sit here. There's 2 plants at Millstone, Connecticut, right on the Long Island Sound. I mean, you take your boat out, you can just go right there, you go past Gardiner's Island.
And we're looking north.
We're looking north, and that's the Millstone plants. Nuclear plants were only supposed to run for 40 years. 40 years, that's what the license was all for, all over the world. Because,
including Indian Point. They're up for renewal, aren't they?
Yeah, well, it was 40 years because the radioactivity causes the metals to become embrittled. It isn't like an old coal plant or whatever that you can have for a century or more. The radioactivity does stuff to the internals of the plant, so 40 years would be the life. But there hasn't been a new nuclear power plant ordered in the United States and built since 1973, since before 3 Mile Island accident in '79. I mean, these are very uneconomic. Nuclear plant costs $13 to $15 billion to build at this point. You can't get money from Wall Street. I mean, the government. That's why Obama wants all these big federal tax subsidies and all kind of loan guarantees
to
and
promote
to promote nuclear, because Wall Street won't touch it. In any case, to kind of keep the industry going at this point, because Wall Street won't touch it again, and you got to keep the nuclear industry alive, it says the people in the nuclear industry. What they've been doing, they've done it now to half the nuclear plants in the United States. Well, a little bit more than half. There's 104. They now nearly relicensed, they call it, 60 nuclear plants to run, not 40 years, but 60 years, including Millstone, including Salem down in New Jersey, which is 2 hours south, Indian Point, the 2 plants there are now up for renewal for 60 years. And both the nuclear industry and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, now that what they want is 80 years. They want these machines that weren't supposed to go beyond 40 at all to run 80 years. Now imagine, you know, I mean, there's my car over there. It's a nice Toyota Prius, I might note, very efficient. 2010, I love it. How the Japanese can make such nice cars and such nice cameras. What are they doing in nuclear? If my car was a, you know, 1941 car, what if it would be a 1921 car? I have to go to the city tomorrow. If I had a 1921 car and I'd have to go on the LIE in a 1920, I mean,
point well made.
They're inviting catastrophe. While I'm at it, just let me mention in terms of the Japanese being so, well, technically proficient. We are too. But in terms of nuclear, what's occurred is remember I mentioned before the Coke and Pepsi of nuclear power, GE and Westinghouse, 2 American companies? They had been 2 American companies in terms of their nuclear divisions. 3 years ago, Toshiba bought the nuclear division of Westinghouse, and Hitachi partnered with GE in its nuclear operations. So in fact, the Japanese have a big stake in nuclear technology. They're now the Coke and Pepsi in partnership with Hitachi, with GE, in terms of one of those, if you want to create the analogy of a soft drink brand. And so that makes one even more concerned about whether we're getting the truth out of Japan. I mean, what's happened is not good for sales. And whether, you know, the Japanese officials at the highest level are going to square with the Japanese people and square with the world about the disaster that has occurred. And you got to put that against the backdrop of, in fact, after 3 Mile Island here in this country, after Chernobyl, the officials in our country, the officials in the Soviet Union, didn't square with those people about what happened. I mean, there was a blackout for several days after Chernobyl. Indeed, I've been told in giving presentations on nuclear technology in Russia, informally by Russians that the end of the Soviet Union was caused largely by the Chernobyl nuclear plant accident. That after that accident, the Communist Party apparatus was so secretive, and out of Kiev, the families of some of the Soviet communist bureaucrats were flown out, and so people were so angry, particularly in the Ukraine, which was the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union, and it started talking about a secession. I mean, because of nuclear energy, nuclear power, and without the Ukraine, you really couldn't have, I've been told, a Soviet Union. So we're talking about nuclear technology having the potential for, well, the breakup or the breakdown of a national state. And again, just to repeat, from zirconium to the extension of operating license, and you can go on with the Price-Anderson Act limiting liability. You can go on with all these issues. This is some crazy way to boil water, threatening, as those three GE nuclear engineers you spoke of before said, the very life on this planet. I mean, that's the issue. It's like Jewish people say, l'chaim, to life, to life. And this technology is against life. This is a life-threatening technology, and those involved in it had known all along. They still know. Okay, maybe Japan 40 years ago didn't have, 30 years ago didn't have coal, didn't have oil. So, I mean, this was the argument for Japan. We're going to have to do nuclear. We don't have natural, energy sources. But look at the photovoltaic panels on my roof. They're made, by Sanyo. I mean, you guys, you've been great in solar. In fact, better in certain respects than we have been in the United States. Japan, there's plenty of wind. Unfortunately, right now, the wind is blowing from the west to the east towards us from Japan. But there's always plenty of wind in that string of islands. I mean, nuclear power plants should never have been built on a string of volcanic islands so earthquake prone. But the fact is, nuclear power plants shouldn't be built anywhere. I mean, there's been some politicians in the U.S. who have said, well, I'm against nuclear power, but we can have them built in remote places. There's only one remote place that a nuclear operation could be, and that's right up there in the sky. It's 93 million miles away. It's called the sun. That's the only place where you could have atoms splitting and, it all going on that's not going to affect us. There should be, in my view, after studying this issue for a long time, since, just let me say that in the 70s, I wasn't convinced as an investigative reporter that nuclear power was dangerous. I didn't know. I mean, I'm not technophobic. I love my Toyota Prius. I love my laptop. I love email. I love flights and airplanes. I'm not a neo-Luddite. In any case, I was doing a TV show on Channel 21 called Long Island World, and I did it was a documentary, actually, for my show on nuclear. And I went to Brookhaven Lab and got the views of the scientists there who said maybe over the centuries there might be a few minor accidents, but the chance of a major accident, absolutely infinitesimal. This is so safe. And I recorded them like you're recording me. And then I went to some opponents here in Long Island, and they talked about the dangers. And I juxtaposed the two in a kind of ping-pong journalism thing. And then I was out, not far from here, in Sag Harbor, doing a story on open space preservation in 1979. And I heard the news of what happened at 3 Mile Island. And I thought, man, those characters at Brookhaven Lab, they try to snow me. They try to snow me. This is a major accident. And at that point, I committed myself to get into all these documents, because in investigative reporting, often it's a paper chase. You look for documents. And in fact, in my book cover-up is pages of documents from that WASH 740 update I mentioned before at Brookhaven Lab, which this is way before those scientists try to bamboozle me. The report talks about catastrophic accidents devastating an area the size of the state of Pennsylvania. And this is before 3 Mile Island almost did that. So I committed myself to doing my first book on nuclear power. I spent a year doing the research. After I was through, I was so shocked by what I found, totally shocked. I figured maybe my Mediterranean blood is overreacting to what I'm reading, and I gave the primary documents, the core material, to about a dozen people, other journalists, John Rather, who wrote for the New York Times for many years, my dear friend, John's also my dear friend, Val Schaffner, who wrote for the East Hampton Star, Dr. Richard Webb, an atomic physicist who wrote the landmark book on accidents, the Accident Hazards of Nuclear Power Plants, University of Massachusetts Press, 1978 grip. They vetted everything I wrote. And so and they came back, you're right, you're absolutely right. These things are horribly dangerous. They're totally uneconomic. There are alternatives, and even then they were beginning to have, and I put out the first book, and I've been on the story, if you want to call this a story. It's more like, even to call it a Shakespearean tragedy, I think Shakespeare would find it hard to put words to this horror.
I know we have to wrap now, Karl.
Sure.
And you've shed some light on what is a subject that is not being reported as you're stating it, that there are alternatives and there are better ways to boil water. And if we could only focus on alternatives without supporting, because it can happen, it did happen, and it will continue to happen. Where could our viewers turn for more information so that they can stay plugged into what you're describing?
Just go to, besides having the honor of being Chief Investigative Reporter for WVVH, for 20 years, I've been principal in a nonprofit company called and putting out documentary after documentary, talk show after talk show on nuclear technology, all available. I mean, you can get them for free now. We just put them on the internet.
It's Enviro? It's
www.envirovideo.com, www.envirovideo.com. 3 Mile Island Revisited is there, the push to revive nuclear power. In fact, just a few months ago, I did a show, Nuclear Power, Dirty, Dangerous, and Expensive, envirovideo.com. And anybody who wants to link with me, if you're a Facebook person, just go to my Facebook page. Be a pleasure. It's so crucial. I mean, I'm a journalist. I'm not an artist. Fixing the transmission of a car, that's complicated. With nuclear power, it's just the most dangerous way to...
And as you've said, there are better ways to boil water.
Much better ways to boil water.
Well, thank you, Karl.
Pleasure, Ernie.
For all of us, we really appreciate your reporting and what you're doing. And thank you for watching this special report here on WVVH-TV.